In the past week or so, the United Nations and the World Bank have warned about global food shortages as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. Those warnings were repeated late this week by S&P Global Ratings, which says the crisis could last years, not months. This week at the Global Food Forum, hosted by the Australian, Anthony Pratt, head of one of the world's largest packaging companies, Visigroup, also spoke about his fears of shortages.
We're living in a VUCA world. That's volatile, uncertain, chaotic and ambiguous. And our hearts go out to the people of the Ukraine. This is all forcing a big shock on the global food system because the Ukraine region is one of the world's 6 food baskets that supply 3/4 of the globe's food commodities. McKinsey believes that we could see 30 million tonnes of the likes of wheat and oil seed disappear in 2022.
So is Australia part of the solution, or will we too feel the impact of these shortages? It's already being seen, for example, in the price of chicken, with stock feed prices rising. Fiona Simpson is the president of the National Farmers Federation and joins us now. Fiona, as always, many thanks for your time. I just want to come to this whole issue about Australia's role in the food supply chain globally. Given the fact that we produce enough food for ourselves generally, is it really that we can help the world feed itself?
Yeah, look, really interesting question, Ross. So Australia is, in global terms, a relatively small niche type of producer. So we produce, in terms of our wheat, for example, a relatively small amount. In terms of our animal protein, a relatively small amount. But in terms of how much we produce here domestically, we export a heap. We use about 30% of it in Australia, and we export about 70%. What's happening now is that with all the shortages in the Ukraine, caused by the war, caused by COVID and the supply chain disruptions, then what we're producing is now in hot demand as well globally, because we're one of the few countries that is actually continuing to produce and have security about the food we have here domestically. So not looking at applying domestic protections, for example, like India is doing. So yes, we're part of the solution. No, we can never be the whole solution because we're only a small portion of it. But absolutely at the moment, what we produce is even in more demand than normal because of all the global pressures.
OK, but there's also pressures on farmers here. If you're producing chicken, the price of stock feed I mentioned, but then there's also the price of electricity for so many of our farmers. There's the price of fertilisers that are going through the roof as a result of rising energy prices. So we're not without our cost pressures inside the farming sector right now.
Absolutely not. And what we're seeing is, all these increases in prices at both the farm gate level and the supply chain level, the freight level, plus the whole supply and demand thing. We've come out of a massive drought on the eastern seaboard not that long ago, followed by a massive flood just in the last few weeks and months that's caused huge supply issues for some of our premium products, particularly when we're talking about meat, for example. We have a very, very low herd number at the moment in Australia because of the drought. We've had issues actually building that herd back up again because of the weather conditions. So we haven't got a huge supply. And then when there's such a massive demand and raises in costs in terms of the supply chain issues, then at the moment what we're seeing is A, a shortage of products, but also B, of course, then that reflected in the price, which is what consumers are paying when they go to the supermarket to pick up a piece of chicken or a steak or an iceberg lettuce, Ross, which was retailing for $12 in one of the Queensland supermarkets during the week.
Which is absolutely crazy. I know that people sit there, and I know it goes to the whole point of trying to shop for whatever's in season at the time. But I just want to go to one other aspect that you just mentioned. That is the supermarkets themselves. Now, the relationship between supermarkets and our farming community has been fractious over more than a decade. And really, it's all about the power of those supermarkets to impose the prices that they want over the price of goods. Right now, are they being more lenient, allowing some of these increases in the supply chain to come back to the farmers, to come back to the suppliers?
Well, we are seeing some really interesting conditions at the moment. For example, in terms of milk price. So, I think that the supermarkets are actually absorbing some of those costs, passing them on to the cost of production onto the farmers and paying them appropriately, but then actually absorbing some of that rise that they would otherwise put on to consumers. So it's a really interesting situation. And we have a complex supply chain in Australia, which we need to maintain. Yes, big is not bad, and the supermarkets certainly serve their purposes in terms of supplying some of the big supply chains that we need to go into our urban areas. But we also need agile supply chains that can supply some of the smaller grocery shops, the independents, the mum and dad butchers and people like that. And that's where the smaller supply chains come in as well, the more localised supply chains that are a critical part if we're going to keep supplying food and fibre at a reasonable price to Australians wherever they live in Australia. And then, of course, also be able to serve the people in urban areas and the people in overseas countries as well. We just need that whole supply chain to be functioning really, really well. It's not just about one end of it, but everybody serves their purpose.
Okay, but bottom line of all of this, food price rises are likely to be coming. There's not terribly much farmers can do about it. There's not terribly much the supermarkets can do about it. And ultimately, the consumers are going to end up paying more.
Ultimately, at the moment, the situation is really complex. The consumers will end up paying more. Everybody at the moment is paying more across the supply chain. Nobody is actually collecting, huge profits because there's just too much cost. Even though the prices are high, the costs are equally high, if not higher. And we're talking by increases of 200 or 300%. And what does that translate to? It just translates to increase in prices at the supermarket and at your local fruit and veggie market. And consumers, really the best thing for them to do is to shop around, buy locally, buy what's in season, and shop around as much as they possibly can.
Fiona Simpson, President of the National Farmers Federation, always good to talk to you, and thanks for your time today.